me what the boy draws. What he produced was not one drawing but seven views of the same piece, approached from different angles, each one annotated in his small, careful handwriting with notes about material, about joinery, about the way light would catch a particular surface. The throne itself was a departure from the expected, low and wide in the traditional style, but with a back panel of interlocking iron leaves, not decorative leaves, but the specific leaf of the iron tree that grew along the Ozen River, rendered in iron with a precision that required someone to have looked at those leaves very carefully and for a very long time. At the base, running along the front edge, was a band of geometric pattern derived from the weaving his mother did. Her basket pattern, translated into metalwork, connected the domestic craft of the village to its industrial one in a single continuous line. Before we begin, if you love stories that will shake your heart and change how you see people, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and your local time. Now, let us get into this story, because what you are about to see, nobody saw it coming. In the village of Igbala, where the river Ozen ran shallow and brown in the dry season and swelled to the color of dark tea in the rains, there was a boy named Dare who was considered, by general agreement, to be unremarkable. This was not cruelty, exactly. The village of Igbala had no particular appetite for cruelty toward its children. It was more a matter of comparison, and comparison was something Igbala did constantly and without apology, the way all small communities do when the pool of people is small and the need to rank and measure is large. Every child in Igbala was held up, consciously or not, against the children around them, and what Igbala saw when it held up Dare was a quiet boy of 12 with thin wrists and a tendency to stare at things longer than was necessary. The fire, the river, the hands of the blacksmith when he worked, as though he were reading something in them that no one else could see. His father, Balagan, was a farmer. His mother, Sod, wove baskets and sold peppers at the weekly market. They were not poor in the way that grinds people down to silence. They were poor in the ordinary village way, which meant they had what they needed most days and worried about the rest. They were good people, warm people, the kind of people the village trusted without thinking about it. But they worried about Dare. He was their only surviving child. 2 others had come and gone in infancy, and perhaps that loss had made them hold Dare at a slight angle, looking at him sideways rather than straight on, afraid that too direct a gaze would invite another catastrophe. He was small for his age. He was quiet in a way that made adults feel they had said something wrong. He never fought with other boys, not because he was afraid, but because the fighting seemed to him a waste of something, though he could not have said what. What he did, instead, was watch. He watched the blacksmith, Oga Femi, from the fence of the forge every afternoon after school. Oga Femi was the finest craftsman in Igbala and possibly in the 3 villages that bordered it, a short, wide man with forearms like tree roots and a face permanently weathered by heat, who made tools and hinges and occasionally decorative pieces that the district officer in the nearby town had been known to purchase. He worked with iron mostly, sometimes brass, occasionally copper when it was available. His forge was the hottest place in Igbala and also, in a way Dare could never fully explain, the most peaceful. Oga Femi had noticed the boy at his fence within the first week. Most people moved on after a day or 2. The forge was hot, the work was loud, and adult attention spans for things that didn't directly concern them were limited. But Dare came back. He came back every afternoon with the same stillness, the same focused attention, the same expression of someone working something out internally. After 3 weeks, Oga Femi spoke to him. "What are you looking at?" He said, not unkindly. "The way you hold the hammer," Dare said. "You change your grip between strikes. Nobody else does that." Oga Femi put down his hammer and looked at the boy more carefully. "How many smiths have you watched?" he asked. "Only you," Dare said. "But I have watched you long enough to know that what you do is different from what the books show." There were no books about smithing in Igbala. Oga Femi knew this. He tilted his head. "What books?" "The ones in the school library," Dare said. "There is one with diagrams of traditional ironwork. Your grip is not in any of the diagrams." Oga Femi was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the gate of the forge. "Come in," he said. "And don't touch anything." Dare did not touch anything for the first 2 weeks. He sat on an upturned crate in the corner of the forge and watched Oga Femi work, and the questions he asked, when he asked them, which was not often, were the kind that made Oga Femi pause before answering, because they were not the questions of a curious child, but the questions of someone who had already thought deeply about a problem and needed only one more piece of information to complete the picture. "When the metal turns that color," Dare said one afternoon, pointing at the iron rod glowing in the coals, "is that the only moment it will hold a new shape, or is there a range?" Oga Femi looked at the rod and then at the boy. "There is a range," he said. "But the middle of the range is the best time. Too early and it fights you. Too late and it fights you differently. How do you know where you are in the range?" "You learn to feel it," Oga Femi said. "Not with your hands. With your eyes and something behind your eyes." Dare nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. At the end of the second week, Oga Femi handed him a hammer. It was a small one, a finishing hammer, lighter than the main tool, used for detail work. He placed a piece of scrap iron in the coals and let it come to heat and then set it on the anvil and stepped back. "Show me how I hold it," he said. Dare looked at the hammer in his hand. He adjusted his grip, not the textbook grip, but the grip he had observed across dozens of afternoons, the slight forward cant of the wrist, the loose thumb, and he struck the iron. The sound it made was right. Not perfect, but right, the clean contact of a hammer that is properly angled, landing on a piece of metal at the correct moment in its cooling. Oga Femi said nothing. He watched Dare strike 3 more times, each one better than the last, watched the boy's face not with the anxious concentration of a beginner, but with the focused calm of someone doing something they had already, in some interior way, done many times before. That evening, Oga Femi went to see Balagan. Balagan received Oga Femi with the hospitality due an elder craftsman and the wariness due a man who has arrived unannounced in the evening with something on his face. He poured palm wine, and they sat on the low wooden stools outside the main door, and the conversation moved through the usual territory: the weather, the harvest prospects, the road repairs that the district council kept promising, before Oga Femi arrived at his point. "Your son has a gift," he said. Balagan was quiet. "He has been watching me work for a month. Today I gave him a hammer for the first time, and he struck like someone who has been doing it for years. I am not speaking loosely, Balagan. What I saw today I have not seen in 30 years of this work." Balagan turned his cup in his hands. He was a man who loved his son with a ferocity that occasionally expressed itself as caution, and he had spent 12 years trying to calculate the safest possible future for a quiet boy in a world that was not always kind to quiet boys. "Smithing," he said, and the word carried several things at once, not contempt, but not enthusiasm either. "I know what you're thinking," Oga Femi said. "You're thinking it's a hard life. You're thinking the money is uncertain. You're thinking there is no school certificate at the end of it, no government posting, no pension." "Those are not small things to think," Balagan said. "They are not," Oga Femi agreed. "But I am not talking about a trade for a boy who has no other options. I am talking about a gift. There is a difference between a man who learns smithing because he needs to eat and a man who was built for it from the inside. Your son is the second kind. I have only met 3 others in my life, and 2 of them became known beyond this district." Balagan looked out at the compound where Dare was helping his mother by firelight, carrying firewood in careful armfuls, his thin wrists working without complaint. "What are you asking?" Balagan said. "Let him come every day after school," Oga Femi said. "Not to work, to learn. I will teach him what I know. If in 6 months there is nothing there, I will tell you honestly, and we will say no more about it." Balagan looked at his son for a long time. He thought about the 2 children who had not survived, about the way Dare watched things, about the school report that said bright but disengaged, about all the ways a person could be built for something the world around them didn't immediately recognize. 6 months, he said finally. Then we talk again. The next 6 months were the happiest of Dare's life, though he would not have used that word for them at the time. The word he would have used, if pressed, was right. Everything in the forge felt right. The weight of the tools, the rhythm of the work, the way the fire spoke if you knew how to listen to it. He learned quickly but not recklessly. Oga Femi had known impatient prodigies before, boys who grasped technique fast and grew bored and took shortcuts, and so he watched for that pattern and found its absence. Dare practiced the same strike hundreds of times before he was satisfied with it. He asked why before he asked how. He made mistakes with the considered attention of someone extracting information from them rather than simply recovering and moving on. By the 3rd month he was making simple things, hooks, hinges, small brackets, under Oga Femi's supervision. By the 4th month he was making them without supervision. By the 5th month he had begun to do something that Oga Femi had not taught him and could not entirely account for. He had begun to make things beautiful. It was not that functional smithing was ugly, but there was a difference between a hinge that worked and a hinge that, in the slight curve of its plate and the finish of its pin, suggested that the person who made it had thought about it as an object that would be seen, not merely used. Dare's pieces had that quality. A set of wall hooks he made for the school headmaster had a taper to them, a refinement at the neck, that made the headmaster turn them in his hands for a long time before he said, "Who made these?" When told, he was quiet for a moment. "Balagan's boy," he said. "Balagan's boy," Oga Femi confirmed. The hooks went up on the headmaster's wall and people commented on them. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that in a city would have passed without notice, but Igbala was not a city and small things did not pass without notice here. The village began, cautiously, to revise its assessment of the quiet boy who stared at things. In the 6th month, the thing happened that changed everything. The Oba of Igbala was a man of traditional sensibility and considerable local pride, and he had been commissioned by the State Cultural Board to provide an exhibit for the Regional Heritage Festival in the district capital, a festival that drew visitors from across the state and occasionally from further, and that the state government used as an argument for cultural investment, which meant that the exhibit needed to be significant. The Oba wanted a throne. Not a copy of an existing piece, but something original, something that expressed the metalworking tradition of Igbala specifically, that could stand in a display hall and tell the story of the village's craft. He had come to Oga Femi first, as he always came to Oga Femi first, and Oga Femi had listened carefully and then said something the Oba had not expected. "I can make you a throne," Oga Femi said, "but I want to make it with my apprentice." The Oba raised an eyebrow. The boy, Oga Femi said. "I will oversee everything. My hands will be on every part of it. But the design should be his." The Oba was not a man who arrived at decisions quickly, but he trusted Oga Femi with the trust of 30 years, and so he said, "Show me what the boy draws." Dare had not been told the purpose when Oga Femi sat him down that evening with paper and charcoal and said, "Draw me a seat of authority. Draw me something that says this village, this craft, this tradition. Take as long as you need." Dare took 3 days. What he produced was not one drawing but seven views of the same piece, approached from different angles, each one annotated in his small, careful handwriting with notes about material, about joinery, about the way light would catch a particular surface. The throne itself was a departure from the expected, low and wide in the traditional style, but with a back panel of interlocking iron leaves, not decorative leaves, but the specific leaf of the iron tree that grew along the Ozone River, rendered in iron with a precision that required someone to have looked at those leaves very carefully and for a very long time. At the base, running along the front edge, was a band of geometric pattern derived from the weaving his mother did. Her basket pattern, translated into metalwork, connected the domestic craft of the village to its industrial one in a single continuous line. Oga Femi looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. "You drew these from your head," he said. "From my head and from the village," Dare said. "Everything in it is already here. I only arranged it." Oga Femi took the drawings to the Oba the next morning. They began work on the first day of the new month, when the rains were just ending and the air had that particular clarity that comes after a long wet season, everything washed, everything sharp-edged, the light returning in full strength as though it had been away and was glad to be back. Oga Femi had never had an apprentice like this. He understood, in the way of a man who has spent his life at a forge, that what he was watching was the thing that craft traditions existed to produce and rarely did, the moment when accumulated skill and innate sensibility arrived in the same person at the same time. He did not interfere more than was necessary. He corrected technique when it needed correcting. He stood back when it did not. The iron leaves were the hardest part. Each one had to be individually shaped, heated, worked, cooled, reheated, and each one had to be slightly different from the others, because real leaves were not identical, and Dare had looked at enough iron leaves to know this and to refuse the shortcut of uniformity. It took him 11 days to make 43 leaves. He worked after school and on weekends, and Balagan, who came to the forge one Saturday and watched for an hour without being noticed, went home and said nothing to anyone but sat with a feeling in his chest that he hadn't felt before and took several days to name. Pride was part of it. But it was larger than pride. It was the feeling of recognizing something, of seeing a truth that had always been present finally become visible. The throne was finished on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the festival. When they stood it in the light of the forge doorway, both of them, master and apprentice, stepping back together to see the whole of it, the silence between them was not the silence of uncertainty but of something completed. The iron leaves caught the light and held it differently than flat metal did, each surface at its own angle, creating a shifting complexity that changed as you moved around the piece. The geometric band at the base connected everything downward, rooted it, gave it gravity. It was extraordinary. They both knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things are diminished by being spoken aloud when they can simply be seen. The Oba came the following morning. He stood before the throne for a very long time, the way the headmaster had stood looking at the hooks, but longer and with more stillness. His 2 attendants stood behind him and said nothing. A palm frond fell from a nearby tree and nobody moved to pick it up. Finally the Oba turned to Dare. "How old are you?" he said. 12, Dare said. "I will be 13 in the next dry season." The Oba looked at him, looked at the thin wrists and the careful eyes and the boy who had produced this thing before him, and nodded once, slowly, in the way that men of genuine authority nod when they have nothing to add to what is already self-evident. The Regional Heritage Festival was held in the district capital on the 3rd Saturday of the dry season, in a long hall attached to the government secretariat that smelled of new paint and old ambition. Exhibits came from 14 villages and 3 towns. There were woven textiles and carved masks and pottery and examples of traditional architecture rendered in miniature. There were photographs of craft traditions and recordings of praise singers and a glass case of ancient coins found in a riverbed. It was a good festival, the kind that reminded people of things they had not known they had forgotten. Dare's throne sat at the center of Igbala's exhibit on a low platform, lit by 2 lamps that Oga Femi had positioned with the care of a man who understood that light was part of the work. People stopped. Not all of them, not immediately, but once the first cluster gathered and stood looking and began to point things out to each other. Look at the leaves, look at the base, look at how it changes when you move. The cluster did not disperse. It grew. By midday, the Igbala exhibit had the longest sustained audience in the hall, and a woman from the State Cultural Board, a small and precise woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, had asked 3 times who the maker was. When she was told, she asked to speak to him. Dare stood before her with the same quietness he brought to everything, and she asked him questions he answered honestly and without performance, about the design, about the process, about where the leaf pattern came from, about the geometric band. She wrote things in a small notebook. She asked if there were more drawings, and he said yes, and she asked if she could see them, and he said he would ask his father. She gave Oga Femi a card with her details and spoke to him for 15 minutes. She mentioned a craft development program the state board ran for young artisans. She mentioned a bursary. She mentioned that the festival jury had met informally after lunch and had made a decision. Igbala's throne won the festival's prize for traditional craft, the first time a village of Igbala size had won in the festival's 12-year history. The news arrived in Igbala before they did. Someone with a mobile phone had called ahead, and when the Oba's car turned into the village that evening, people had gathered at the compound gate with drums that hadn't been used in months, making a sound that the night absorbed and returned in echoes off the trees. Dare sat in the back of the car and watched through the window as Igbala came toward him. His village, his river, the forge fence where he had stood for weeks before anyone opened the gate, and felt the feeling that he had spent his whole quiet life searching for without knowing he was searching, the feeling of being precisely where he was supposed to be, doing precisely what he was supposed to do, seen by precisely the people who needed to see him. His mother was at the gate. She reached into the car before it had fully stopped and took his face in both her hands, the hands that wove baskets, that sold peppers, that had always worked, and looked at him the way she had looked at him since the day he was born, with that fierce and slightly terrified love that parents carry for the children they nearly lost. "I always knew," she said. And then, because honesty was also something she had given him, "I always hoped." Dare continued at the forge. He took the state board's bursary and used it for materials, not for leaving. The secondary school scholarship came through Mrs. Adeyemi, the precise, determined woman from the cultural board, and he studied hard in the district capital through the week and came home every weekend without fail, walking the last mile from the bus stop with his school bag on one shoulder and the week's accumulated ideas in his head, ready to be tested against iron and fire. Oga Femi taught him everything he knew. And then, with the grace that belongs only to the truly great, he began to learn from his student, because Dare brought to the old craft a precision and a hunger that stretched what the forge could do, and Oga Femi was secure enough in himself to receive this as a gift rather than a threat. They worked side by side with the easy silence of people who communicate most clearly without words, the master's experience and the apprentice's instinct finding, between them, a quality of work that neither could have reached alone. Commissions came. Slowly at first, a chief in a neighboring district, a school wanting ceremonial gates, a family who had seen the throne photographs and wanted something for a naming ceremony. Then less slowly. The cultural magazine that had published the throne photographs received letters asking about the young maker in Igbala. Mrs. Adeyemi forwarded 2 of them to Oga Femi with a note that said simply, "It is beginning." Balagan still farmed. He still rose before sunrise and walked his rows with the patience of a man who understands that growth cannot be hurried. He still worried, but the worry had changed its quality. It was no longer formless, no longer the low-grade dread of a father who cannot see what his child is for. It was something cleaner, the specific, manageable concern of a man who can see exactly where his son is going and knows only that the road is long and the world is uneven. He never said any of this to Dare directly. That was not his language. But on the evening of Dare's 17th birthday, after the small celebration had ended and the compound had gone quiet, Balagan went to the forge. He did not go inside. He stood at the gate, the same gate his son had stood at for weeks at 12 years old, looking in with those eyes that saw too much, and he looked at the forge the way Dare had always looked at things, trying to understand the pull of it, trying to see what his son saw in the fire and the iron and the particular music of hammer on anvil. He could not quite. The gift was not his to have. But standing at the gate in the cool evening air, listening to the sound of his son working inside, that steady, unhurried rhythm, the sound of a person in complete agreement with themselves, Balagan felt something release in his chest. Something he had been holding since the first of his children did not survive. Since the second. Since the day Dare was born and he had looked at him with love tangled up in terror, unable to fully separate one from the other. He let it go now. Quietly, with no ceremony, the way the best releases happen. He is going to be all right, Balagan thought. Not as a hope. As a fact, finally arrived. He turned and walked back across the compound, past the cooking fire his wife had let burn to embers, past the Iroko sapling he had planted the year Dare was born and that now stood higher than the roof, and he went inside and slept the deep sleep of a man who has set down something heavy and found, to his surprise, that his hands still worked. In the forge, Dare worked alone. The piece he was making was small, a gift for his mother, unasked for and unannounced, something he had been designing in the back of his mind for months between commissions and schoolwork and everything else. A set of decorative clasps for her basket-weaving frame, made in the pattern she had spent 30 years producing in thread and cane, translated now into iron by the hands she had fed and steadied and sent out into the world. He had been working on it for 3 evenings. Tonight he would finish it. He brought the last piece to heat and watched it move through its colors in the coals, red, orange, the particular yellow-white that meant the metal was fully ready, and then he lifted it to the anvil and worked it with the focused quiet of someone who has stopped thinking about what they are doing and simply does it, the way a river stops thinking about the valley and simply runs. When it was done, he held it to the lamplight and turned it in his fingers. The pattern was exact. The surface was clean. The iron had taken the shape it was given without argument, the way good material does in good hands. Outside, the village of Igbala was settling into its night. The river Ozen moved in the darkness beyond the trees, carrying its patient water southward. The iron leaves held still in the windless air. Dogs barked once, twice, and went quiet. Someone's radio played faintly from 3 compounds away, a woman's voice singing something old. Dare set the clasp down beside its pair and sat for a moment in the cooling forge, in the smell of iron and charcoal and honest work, in the particular peace that belongs to people who have found the thing they were made for and are doing it. He was 17 years old. He had his whole life in front of him like an unworked bar of iron, full of everything it could become, patient, waiting for the hands that knew it. He banked the coals, hung his apron, and walked out into the night. The stars over Igbala were very bright. He looked up at them the way he had always looked at things, for a long time, without hurrying, reading something in them that was not quite words. Then he walked home. Every story needs a witness. Thank you for being this one's. See you in the next story. God bless you.